Step into the velvet darkness of a story well told, where the shadows are deep and the emotions are even deeper than before. We bring you the smooth, cinematic narratives that explore the quiet and beautiful mysteries of the soul. Click subscribe now and lose yourself in our shadows. The tablecloth my late wife Margaret sewed by hand was still on the dining room table that evening. 34 years old, slightly faded at the edges, but I had never been able to bring myself to replace it. She had spent 3 weeks on it the winter before our youngest was born, sitting by the fireplace in our old house in Oakville, while the snow came down outside. Every time I smoothed my hand across it before a family dinner, I felt her there with me still. I had set the table myself that Sunday. Roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds, the same meal Margaret used to make every time the whole family gathered. I had learned to cook it reasonably well over the past 11 years. Since she passed, it was never quite as good as hers. But my sons always said they appreciated it. At least, they used to say that there were 6 of us that evening. My eldest son, Richard, and his wife Claire, my second son, Daniel, and his girlfriend Suzanne, and my youngest, Patrick, who had recently moved back to the Toronto area after several years working in Vancouver. I was 63 years old. My sons were 38, 35, and 31. Old enough, I had always thought, to know better. I want to explain something before I tell you what happened that night, because I know what you are probably already thinking. You are thinking, how could your own sons not know what their father did for a living? It is a fair question, and I have asked myself the same thing many times since. The honest answer is that I never made my work the center of our family life. When the boys were growing up, I was simply their dad. I coached Richard's hockey team for 4 seasons. I drove Daniel to his guitar lessons every Saturday morning for 3 years. I helped Patrick with his science fair projects until he was old enough to tell me my ideas were embarrassing. I was present. I was engaged. What I did not do was bring my work home with me, talk about it at the dinner table, or measure my worth as a father by the size of my company. The other part of the answer is more complicated. I built my company, a mid-sized commercial property management firm based in Mississauga. Over a period of almost 30 years, I started it alone when the boys were still very young, working from a spare bedroom while Margaret managed everything else. By the time the boys were teenagers, the company had grown enough that I moved it into a proper office and hired real staff. But I had structured the company deliberately, under a holding group with a different name than my own. There were legal and financial reasons for this that I won't bore you with. The practical result was that my name did not appear prominently in any public-facing materials. I was not hiding who I was. I simply had no reason to advertise it. My sons knew I worked in commercial real estate in some capacity. They knew I had an office in Mississauga. They knew I wore a suit to work most days and sometimes traveled to meetings in other cities. None of them had ever asked me anything more specific than that. I had told myself over the years that this was simply the natural distance that grows between adult children and their parents. Now I wonder if I was making excuses for their lack of curiosity. Either way, when they were hired at the firm, it happened through the standard HR process. Their resumes came in through a recruiter. They were hired because they were qualified, not because they were my sons. I had a strict policy about that. And my HR director at the time did not know my last name, connected me to them until after the offers were signed. I kept quiet about it because I wanted to see who they truly were when they believed no one was watching. 11 months of watching had told me a great deal. Richard was a project coordinator on the commercial leasing side. Daniel worked in property operations. Patrick had joined the marketing team. They were competent enough, though none of them had distinguished themselves in any particular way. What I had observed through quiet inquiries and the occasional anonymous walkthrough of the office was that all 3 of them had developed a certain attitude They took long lunches. They submitted expenses that stretched the definition of business-related. Richard had canceled 2 site visits in the same month because, as he told his direct manager, he did not see the point of going in person when everything could be handled by email. I had that conversation reported back to me word for word, but that was work. What happened at my dinner table that Sunday evening was something else entirely. It started quietly, the way most bad things do. We had finished the main course and I had just come back from the kitchen with the apple crumble I had spent most of the afternoon making. Patrick made a comment about the crumble being a bit dry. I said I thought it had turned out reasonably well. Claire, Richard's wife, said nothing, which was her way of agreeing with Patrick without being impolite about it. I did not take any of this personally. I have never been a particularly gifted baker. Then Richard leaned back in his chair and looked around the table in the way he sometimes did when he was about to say something he had clearly rehearsed. I had seen that look on his face since he was about 14 years old. He said he had been doing some thinking lately. He said he had been talking to Daniel and Patrick as well. He said that all 3 of them were concerned about me. I asked what they were concerned about. He said that I was getting older, and that the house was getting to be too much for one person to manage. He said that the yard alone was more than I should be handling at my age. He said that they had looked into a few options and wanted to share them with me. I asked what kind of options. Daniel pulled out his phone and started reading from something he had apparently prepared in advance. He described a retirement residence in Burlington. He said the monthly fee was around $4,000. He said it was clean and well-reviewed, and that I would have my own room and access to communal meals and organized activities. I sat very still. Patrick said that the house would need to be sold, of course, to cover the costs long-term. He said the market in my neighborhood was still fairly strong and that they had spoken to a real estate agent friend of Claire's, John Tithing, who thought they could get somewhere between $900,000 and $1.1 million, depending on timing. I said nothing. I was doing the math in my head and also trying to understand what I was hearing. Richard said that they did not want me to feel like they were pushing me out of my own home. He said they wanted me to feel like this was a family decision. Then he smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and said, "Dad, we just think you'd be happier somewhere with people your own age." Claire raised her wine glass slightly. Not quite a toast, just an acknowledgement. Suzanne looked at the tablecloth. Patrick said nothing further. I asked Richard, very quietly, if this was something they had all agreed on together. He said yes. I asked when they had started planning this. He paused. Daniel looked at his phone again. Patrick cleared his throat. Richard said they had been discussing it for a few months. A few months. While they were coming to my Sunday dinners and eating my food and telling me the chicken was good. They had been planning to sell my house and put me in a room in Burlington. The house their mother had loved. The house where all 3 of them had grown up. The house with the backyard maple tree that Patrick had fallen out of when he was 7 and broken his collarbone, and which he apparently now saw only as square footage to be liquidated. I looked at the tablecloth Margaret had sewn. I said I would think about it. Richard looked relieved. Daniel put his phone away. Patrick started talking about something else entirely, as though the previous 10 minutes had simply been a routine agenda item now moved past. I cleared the table myself that night after they left. I washed the dishes by hand, the way I always do. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking out at the backyard. The maple tree was still there, bare in the November cold. I did not sleep much that night. By the time I arrived at the office Monday morning, I had made several decisions. I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who acts out of pure anger. I had spent a sleepless night examining my own role in what had happened. I asked myself honestly whether I had failed my sons in some fundamental way, whether I had been too absent, too withholding, too focused on building something they had never understood. I sat with those questions seriously. I still sit with them, but There is a difference between understanding how something came to be and accepting that it should continue. My sons were not children who did not know better. They were grown men in their 30s who had sat at my table, eaten food I had prepared in memory of their mother, and presented me with a plan to sell my home while I was still healthy, still sharp, still more than capable of managing my own life and affairs. They had made that plan without asking me a single question about what I wanted. They had assumed, based on nothing more than my age and my quiet manner, that I was a problem to be managed. I had been watching them for nearly a year. I knew who they were at work. Now I knew who they were at home. I called my executive assistant, Diane, when I got in and asked her to arrange a meeting of the department heads and team leads for 10 o'clock. 31 people. I told her to book the large boardroom and to make sure Richard Callahan, Daniel Callahan, and Patrick Callahan were all on the attendance list. She paused for just a moment before saying, "Of course, I spent the time before 10 going through the files I had been quietly accumulating on each of my son's performance over the previous 11 months. The canceled site visits, the expense reports, the pattern of late arrivals and early departures that Daniel's direct manager had flagged twice without any action being taken, partly because nobody wanted to escalate something involving an employee with the same last name as the company's parent entity, even if they did not know exactly what that connection meant. At 5 minutes to 10, I walked into the boardroom. I rarely attended department meetings in person. I was usually represented by my COO, a woman named Helen Forsyth, who had been with me for 16 years and who was one of the only people in the building who knew exactly who I was and what I owned. Helen was already seated at the far end of the table. She gave me a single look when I came in, the kind of look that meant she understood what was happening without needing to be told. The room filled up. My sons came in separately. Richard arrived first and took a seat near the middle of the table, glancing around with the mild impatience of someone who resented having his morning interrupted. Daniel came in scrolling through his phone. Patrick arrived last, slightly out of breath, and sat down next to a colleague from the marketing team. None of them looked at me with any particular recognition. I was, to them, a white-haired man in a suit who occasionally appeared at company-wide events and whom they probably assumed was a senior consultant of some kind. I had kept my presence in the day-to-day operations of the office deliberately minimal. I stood at the head of the table, and I waited until the room was quiet. Then I introduced myself. My full name, my title, my ownership stake in the company, and the holding group above it. I watched my sons' faces as I spoke. I will not dramatize what I saw there. I will simply say that Richard's expression moved through several distinct phases over the course of about 15 seconds, and that by the time I had finished speaking, all three of them were very still. I went through the performance concerns professionally and without theatrics. I had Helen distribute printed summaries to the relevant managers. I made clear that the issues I was raising applied to several members of the team, not exclusively to my sons. I did not want a scene. I wanted a record. I asked Richard, Daniel, and Patrick to stay after the rest of the room cleared. The three of them sat across from me at the long table. Richard's jaw was set. Daniel had put his phone face down in front of him and had not picked it up again. Patrick looked like he was trying to decide whether any version of this situation might still be recoverable. I told them that their employment was being terminated effective immediately. I told them that severance packages had been prepared in accordance with Ontario employment law and that their HR contacts would walk them through the details. I told them that their access cards and system credentials would be deactivated by end of day. Richard said, "Dad," I said, "at the moment I'm speaking to you as your employer. We can speak as family another time, if you choose." He said nothing else. I had security escort them out, which I knew was the part that would sting the most. Not cruelly, not with any public spectacle, but firmly and finally, the way things need to be done when they need to be done. I did not feel triumphant when I walked back to my office. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to grief. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about the hockey practices and the guitar lessons and the science fair projects. I thought about Margaret and what she would have made of all of it. I think she would have been heartbroken. I think she also would have understood why I could not simply let it go. The weeks that followed were quiet. Richard called twice in the first week. I did not answer. Daniel sent an email that was long and somewhat incoherent, and ended with a sentence about how I had always made him feel like he was never good enough. I read it carefully and did not respond immediately. Patrick sent a single text message that said only, "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know what we were thinking." I read that one several times. I am not a man who enjoys silence or isolation. I have my routines, my work, a few close friends I see regularly, a neighbor named Gordon who is about my age and who comes over on Friday evenings, and we watch hockey and argue about the Leafs, a woman named Barbara from my old church choir who calls every couple of weeks and who has a sharp enough wit that she can make me laugh even on difficult days. My life was not empty before my sons arrived for that Sunday dinner, and it was not empty after they left. But the house was quieter in a particular way that I noticed about 6 weeks after the termination. On a Saturday afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. I was not expecting anyone. I looked through the front window before I answered it, and I saw my grandson, Tyler. He is Richard's son, 17 years old. A serious-faced kid who plays chess competitively and who has always reminded me a little of myself at that age. He had taken the GO train out from Oakville by himself. I opened the door and he stood there in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and he said, "Grandpa, I think I need to talk to you." I let him in. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table and he told me what he had overheard at home over the previous 6 weeks. He told me that his father and uncles had not fully understood the consequences of what they had set in motion. He told me that his mother Claire had been much quieter than usual. He said, very carefully, that he did not think what they had planned at dinner had been right, and that he had said so at the time and been told it was not his business. I asked him why he had come. He said, "Because I am your grandson and I was worried about you, and because someone should say it to your face." I looked at this 17-year-old boy who had taken a train by himself on a cold Saturday to sit in my kitchen and tell me I mattered to him. I thought about the conversation I had avoided having with his father for 11 months. I thought about the tablecloth. I told Tyler that I appreciated him coming. I told him that I was not angry with him and that I had never been angry with him. I told him I was glad he had said what he said. He asked me if I was going to forgive his dad. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him that forgiveness is not a switch you flip. I told him it was something I was thinking about carefully, and that thinking about it carefully was the most honest thing I could offer. He nodded like that made sense to him. We finished our tea and I drove him to the GO station and watched him disappear through the doors. I have since spoken to Patrick once, briefly, by phone. He sounded genuinely shaken in a way that I found credible. We did not resolve anything, but the door is not closed. I have not yet spoken to Richard or Daniel. I have had a lot of time to sit with everything that happened and to think about what kind of man I want to be on the other side of it. I do not want to be a man who holds permanent grudges against his own children. I do not want Margaret's tablecloth to become a symbol of bitterness rather than of her. I want to find my way to something that resembles peace, even if it is not the same as it was before. But I also know this. You cannot rebuild trust by pretending the damage was not real. My son sat at my table and planned my future without asking me a single question about what I wanted. That will not become something I simply absorb and forget. If there is a path back, it runs through genuine acknowledgement of what was done, not around it. I will not be hurried down it, and I will not be guilt-tripped down it, and I will not be managed down it by grown men who thought their aging father was a problem to be solved. I am 63 years old. I built something from nothing over 30 years. I raised 3 sons while grieving a wife. I still cook Sunday roast chicken from memory, and I still smooth my hand across Margaret's tablecloth before I set the table. Even on the Sundays when no one is coming, I am still here, still standing, and I will decide what comes next on my own terms, in my own time. That is the only way I know how to do it. It is the only way I have ever known.